My name is Dan Oddy, and today we're going to show you how to install the Detroit Speed SpeedMAX front suspension system. This kit is designed for the 1967 to 87 GM C10 pickup trucks. This kit is extremely easy to install and can be done in your garage over the weekend. The best part about this kit is you don't have to remove any body panels or even the engine to install it. Today we're going to install it on Kyle Tucker's 1983 C10, so let's get started. To begin, raise the truck on jack stands so that the frame is level with the ground. Once the truck is off the ground and secure, remove the front wheels, then remove both brake hoses from the brake calipers. Remove the brake hose bracket from the upper control arm so it is free from the suspension on both sides and move the brake hoses out of the way. It's helpful to push a piece of rubber hose in the brake hose fitting to keep it from leaking. At this point, you can remove the fasteners that hold the idler arms to the outside of the frame rail. Once removed, push the idler arm away from the frame rail. Remove the pitman arm nut from the steering box, then remove the pitman arm itself and move it out of the way. Pitman arm puller is highly recommended for the removal process. From the front side of the factory cradle, remove the engine mount hardware, then remove the bolts from the back side of the cradle. Do this on both sides of the truck. Using an engine hoist, lift the engine up and out of the engine mounts. Place a jack stand with a block of wood underneath the truck toward the back of the engine. Lower the engine back down so the oil pan is resting on the block of wood. The engine mounts should be free from the engine stands on the cradle. The two bolts on top of either side of the frame rail that secure the engine stands in place can now be removed, followed by the two lower engine stand bolts. Drop the engine mount brackets down and out of the cradle. If the engine mounts are old and worn, it's recommended that they be replaced. Next, remove the bolt that holds the fuel line clamp to the cradle. Locate and remove the 3 bolts on each side of the cradle that hold it to the frame rails. Use a wrench on the top side of the cradle to hold the flange nuts and remove the bolts. Locate the 2 lower bolts on the inside of the frame rail that hold the upper control arm bracket to the frame. Remove these bolts from the welded nut inserts on the upper control arm brackets on both sides of the truck. Place a floor jack underneath the cradle and lift up slightly. Remove the remaining 2 bolts on each side of the frame rail that are left in the upper control arm mounting brackets. With all the hardware removed, slowly lower the floor jack down. Make sure that nothing is still attached and preventing the cradle from being fully removed from the truck. Once lowered, roll the cradle out from underneath the truck. Loosen the pinch bolt from the rag joint and pry the rag joint off the steering gear. Disconnect the power steering pressure and return lines by loosening the fittings with a wrench. Plug the lines and the steering gear to keep them from leaking. On the inside of the frame rail, loosen the bolts that hold the steering gear box in place. Carefully remove the bolts from the steering gear box so it does not fall to the ground. The steering gear is heavy and may require assistance to remove it without causing any damage. Now that the steering gear box is removed, you can remove the hardware that holds the steering coupler to the steering column, followed by the steering coupler itself. You may need to use a hammer to tap it off the end of the steering column. Now that your existing cradle has been removed, it's time to start installing the Detroit Speed SpeedMAX system. Place 3 of the provided 1/2" 20 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the bottom side of each of the frame rails where the factory cradle was installed. They have a small amount of anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Position the DSC cradle assembly under the truck. Line up the DSC cradle to the frame rails so the bolts pass through the top side of the cradle. Keep in mind, this kit was designed to be used with both the 67 and 72 and the 73 to 87 C10s. We provided 2 sets of mounting holes in the cradle. Use the rear set of holes to move the front axle forward by 1 inch. This is recommended for the 67 to 72 applications to assist with fender alignment. Use the forward set of holes to maintain a stock wheelbase, which is recommended for the 73 to 87 applications. Once you have the cradle in position, install the provided 1/2" 20 nylock nuts and washers onto the 1/2" bolts to keep the cradle secured to the frame rails. Lightly snug the 1/2" hardware, but do not fully tighten the bolts just yet. Next, locate the left and right hand side upper control arm mount brackets. Place 2 of the provided 1/2" 20 by 3 inch long bolts through the flat side of the upper control arm mount brackets. Place the upper control arm mounting brackets on top of the cradle assembly outboard of the frame rails. Make sure you have the correct bracket on each side as they are side specific. The flat side with the head of the bolt will sit against the outboard frame rail and the bottom of the bracket will sit on the top of the cradle. Ensure that the upper control arm bracket's mounting holes line up with the mounting holes in the cradle. If they don't, Loosen the 1/2 inch hardware as needed to adjust the cradle. Place 2 of the provided 7/16 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the row of holes closer to the frame on the upper control arm mount brackets. Place a dab of anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Do this on both sides of the truck so the bolts pass through the cradle. Use the provided 7/16 nylock nuts and washers to loosely install the brackets to the cradle on both sides of the truck. Lightly snug the hardware, but do not fully tighten the bolts just yet. Place 4 of the provided 7/16 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the outboard side of the upper control arm brackets on both sides of the truck. There should be 4 open holes that will allow the bolts to pass through the control arm bracket and frame rail. Next, remove the engine mounts from the factory cradle brackets that were removed earlier. Install them on the factory engine mount brackets with the factory hardware. It is recommended that you replace your engine mounts if your original ones are old and worn out. Locate the left and right hand engine mount brackets. The slotted hole in the brackets will be towards the front of the truck when installed against the inside of the frame rail. Position the brackets on the threads of 2 of the 7/16 bolts towards the front of the truck. These are the bolts that were installed through the upper control arm mount brackets and the frame rail. One of the bolts will pass through the slotted holes in the engine mount brackets. Place the provided 7/16 nylock nuts and washers on all 8 bolts on the inside of the frame rail on both sides of the truck. Install the provided 3/816 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the lower engine mount brackets and into the cradle assembly. Place anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Place the provided 3/816 prevailing torque flange nuts and washers on the threads of the bolts. Access the bolts through the windows in the bottom side of the cradle assembly. Do not tighten the hardware at this time. Lower the engine down and install the original hardware that was removed through the engine mounts and the engine mount brackets bolted to the DC cradle. Place 2 of the provided 7/16 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the outboard row of holes in the upper control arm brackets on both sides of the truck. At this point, you may tighten and torque most of the hardware. Torque the 1/2 inch 20 hardware to 85 foot-pounds. Torque the 7/16 hardware to 58 foot-pounds. And torque the 3/816 hardware to 28 foot-pounds. Do not torque the 7/16 bolts that were placed in the outside row of the upper control arm brackets. Next, locate the upper control arms. The upper control arms are not directional and can be installed on either side of the truck. Place the cross shafts of the control arms onto the 1/2 inch 20 by 3 inch long bolts that have been installed in your upper control arm mounting brackets. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts. Place the provided 1/2 inch 20 nylock nuts and 1/2 inch washers onto the threads of the upper control arm bolts on both sides of the truck, but do not tighten the hardware just yet. If you have installed the cradle assembly in the stock location, maintaining the factory wheelbase, install 4 of the provided 1 1/8 by 1/8 inch thick body shims on each of the upper control arm bolts. If using the 1 inch forward location, install 5 of the provided 1 1/8 by 1/8 inch thick body shims on each of the upper control arm bolts. Tighten the upper control arms to the brackets, keeping the shims in place. Torque the 1/2 inch 20 upper control arm cross shaft mounting nuts to 75 foot-pounds. Remove the 7/16 by 1½ inch long bolts and washers that were placed in the outside row of the upper control arm brackets. Locate the coated cast steel upper coilover mounts. There is an L and an R cast into these parts to determine the left and right hand sides. Place the upper coilover mount on the outboard side of the frame rail so it sits on top of the upper control arm bracket. Line up the top inboard hole on the coilover mounts with the hole on the top flange of the upper control arm brackets. The bottom 2 holes will line up with the outboard set of holes on the upper control arm brackets. Place 2 of the provided 7/16 by 1½ inch long bolts and washers through the bottom of the coilover mounts, through the upper control arm brackets, and through the cradle assembly on both sides of the truck. Install 1 of the provided 7/16 by 1¼ inch long bolts and washers through the top inboard hole of the coilover mounts and through the top flange of the upper control arm brackets on both sides of the truck. Keep in mind, the coilover mounts will sit outboard of the upper control arm cross shaft. If you're running stock inner fenders, you will need to modify them to give you some clearance around the coilover mounts. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and install the provided 7/16 nylock nuts and washers on all 6 bolts and tighten. Torque the 7/16 hardware to 58 foot-pounds. Next, locate the sway bar bracket assemblies and the sway bar frame mount brackets. Identify which sway bar bracket assembly will be for the left and right hand side of the truck. These will need to be assembled by placing the frame mount tabs inside the sway bar brackets. Install the provided 7/16 by 2½ inch long bolts and washers through the slotted hole in the sway bar brackets to hold the frame mounts in place. The open hole on the sway bar bracket will be mounted to the front lower control arm bolt. Place one of the provided lower control arm 9/16 18 by 3 3/4 inch long bolts and washers into the front lower control arm mount in the cradle. Install the provided 9/16 18 nylock nut and washer on the threads of the bolt. Tighten the hardware just enough so the sway bar bracket assembly can still be moved by hand. Then place a 7/16 20 nylock nut and washer on the sway bar bracket bolts. Position the sway bar bracket assembly so it is square to the bottom of the frame rail. Use a right angle scribe to mark the hole location for the frame mount on the frame rail. Drill through both hole locations of the frame rail to a final drill size of 15-30 seconds. Next, you'll need to notch the top frame rail to allow the steering shaft to be connected to the rack and pinion. Locate the provided steering shaft frame rail reinforcement. This will be used as a template to notch the top frame rail. See the written instructions for assistance with this step. Install the frame rail reinforcement to the top of the frame rail using pre-existing holes. Use the provided 3/8 16 by 1 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers, and tighten the reinforcement to the frame rail. Next, install the provided M16 1.5 and M18 1.5 fittings into the ports of the steering rack. Tighten the fittings using a 19mm wrench, being careful not to over-tighten them. Thread the provided M14 1.5 jam nuts onto both ends of the inner tie rods on the rack and pinion using anti-seize on the threads. Install the outer tie rods onto the inner tie rods up to the jam nuts. Before installing the rack and pinion, verify the center position of the rack on a bench. See the written instructions for assistance with this step. Now is a good time to slide the U-joint provided in the DSC steering coupler kit onto the input shaft on the rack and pinion. Position the rack and pinion to the front side of the cradle assembly. Install the provided M16 2.0 by 100mm flange head hex bolts into the threaded steering rack mounts in the cradle. Use blue Loctite on the threads of the bolts and torque them to 180 foot-pounds. Next, remove the frame mounts from the sway bar brackets. Use the provided 7/16 20 by 1.25 inch long bolts, nylock nuts, and washers, and install them to the frame rail using the holes that were drilled earlier. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolts and make sure the mounts are square to the frame rails. Torque the hardware to 58 foot-pounds. Insert the provided sway bar frame mount crush sleeves in between the tabs of the frame mount so the holes line up. You may need to spread the tabs on the frame mount brackets to install the crush sleeves. Reinstall the 7/16 20 by 2.5 inch long bolts and washers through the sway bar brackets, frame mounts, and the crush sleeves on both sides of the truck. Install the 7/16 20 nylock nuts and washers onto the threads of the bolts and be sure to use anti-seize on the threads. Do not tighten at this time. Next, identify the left and right hand lower control arm. The sway bar and link bracket on the lower control arms will be towards the front of the truck when installed. With the lower control arm positioned to the mount in the cradle assembly, install the sway bar bracket assembly and provided 9/16 18 by 3 3/4 inch long bolts and washers through the front of the lower control arm mount. Install the other 9/16 18 by 3 3/4 inch long bolt and washer to the rearward lower control arm mount. Install the provided 9/16 18 nylock nuts and washers onto the threads of the bolts. Use anti-seize on the bolts and tighten. Torque the 9/16 18 hardware to 95 foot-pounds. Repeat this process on the opposite side of the truck. Once the lower control arms are installed, torque both 7/16 20 sway bar bracket bolts to 45 foot-pounds. Now we can install the sway bar to the sway bar mounting brackets. Use the provided super grease to lubricate the inside of the polyurethane bushings. Spread the polyurethane bushings so they fit around the sway bar and position it as close to the bends on the sway bar as possible. Place the sway bar bushing brackets over the bushings on the sway bar. Line up the sway bar to the mounting brackets on the cradle assembly. Add blue Loctite to the provided 3/8 16 by 3/4 inch long bolts and install with washers through the sway bar bushing brackets, threading them into the weld nuts on the sway bar brackets. Torque the 3/8 16 hardware to 28 foot-pounds. Next, assemble each coilover shock and spring before installing them on the truck. See the written instructions for assistance with this step. Pass the shock assembly between the upper control arm tubes towards the body. Line up the coilover shock and spring assembly to the cast steel upper shock mount. Install the provided 1/2 inch 20 by 2.5 inch long bolt and washer through the upper shock mount, tapered spacers, and monoball. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolt and install the provided 1/2 inch 20 nylock nut and washer. Tighten the hardware, but do not torque. Raise the lower control arm assembly so the welded in shock mount reaches the shaft side mount on the shock. Place the provided 1/2 inch 20 by 2.5 inch long bolt through the provided 3/4 OD by 5 inch long steel bushing. Install the 1/2 inch 20 by 2.5 inch long bolt and steel bushing through the back side of the lower control arm shock mount and mountable. Use anti-seize on the threads of the bolt and install the 1/2" 20 nylock nut and washer. Torque the shock mount hardware to 60 foot-pounds. Repeat this process for the opposite side of the truck. Next, install the sway bar end links to the lower control arms. Install one end of the end link to the mounting bracket on the lower control arm. The end link will be installed with a stud pointing to the front of the truck. Install the provided M12 1.75 prevailing torque flange nut on the end link stud and repeat this process for the opposite side of the truck. Torque both lower flange nuts to 53 foot-pounds. Connect the sway bar to the end link by passing the stud through the mounting hole in the sway bar. Install the provided M12 1.75 prevailing torque flange nut on the end link stud using red Loctite. Repeat this process for the opposite side of the truck. Separate the split lock collars into 2 pieces. Place them around the sway bar so they are tight against the inside of the sway bar bushings on both sides of the truck. Reassemble using blue Loctite on the threads of the bolts and torque to 14 foot-pounds. Remove the castle nut, washer, and cotter pin from the lower and upper control arm ball joint stud so we can install the upright assembly. Locate the left and right upright corner assemblies. The steering arms will point towards the front of the truck when installed. Place the upright assembly over the lower ball joint stud on the lower control arm and reinstall the castle nut and washer onto the ball joint stud to hold the upright in place. Tighten the castle nut but do not torque just yet. Move the upper control arm down so the upper ball joint stud passes through the mounting hole in the upright. Install the castle nut onto the ball joint stud and tighten, but again do not torque. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Remove the nylock nut from the outer tie rods. With the wheel hubs parallel to the frame rail, adjust the outer tie rods so the ball joint will install into the mounting hole of the steering arm. Verify that the steering is centered and install the castle nuts onto the outer tie rods. Torque the outer tie rod castle nut to 44 foot-pounds. Repeat this process for the opposite side of the truck. Next, torque the upper ball joint nut to 60 foot-pounds. Make sure the slot in the castle nut lines up with the cotter pin hole and install the cotter pin. Move to the opposite side of the truck and repeat. Torque the lower ball joint nut to 100 foot-pounds. Again, make sure that the slot in the castle nut lines up with the cotter pin hole. Install the cotter pin and do the same on the opposite side. If you have purchased the DSC brake rotor kit, install the rotors onto the hub on both sides of the truck. Once the brake rotors have been placed on the hub pack, install the brake caliper to the DSC drop spindle using the provided M14 2.0 by 40 mm flange head hex bolts. They will thread into the brake caliper through the back side of the DSC spindle. Use red Loctite on the threads of the bolts and tighten. Torque the caliper mounting bolts to 129 foot-pounds. Repeat this process for the opposite side of the truck. If you have purchased the DSC brake hose bracket kit, place one of the brake hose brackets to the top of the DSC drop spindle so the bracket wraps around the backside of the upper ball joint. Install the bracket to the spindle using 2 of the provided M5.8 by 10 mm flange bolts. Install the brake hose to the brake caliper on both sides of the truck. We hope this video was able to give you a little insight on how to install the Detroit Speed SpeedMAX front suspension system on the 67 to 87 C10 trucks. If you have any questions, please call us at 704-662-3272 or send us an email at tech@detroitspeed.com. Don't forget to like and follow us on our social media, or you can visit our website at detroitspeed.com. My name is Dan Oddy, and thanks for watching.